I recently completed the Resident Evil 4 remake and had some split opinions on it. While the game's locations are stunning and the monsters haunting, there are some vital issues with this game that prevent it from being a true masterpiece. Important note, this is a breakdown of the Resident Evil 4 remake, not the original Resident Evil 4. An important disclaimer, this was actually the first Resident Evil game I've ever played. While I acknowledge there are over 25 other Resident Evil games I haven't played, which will inevitably skew my understanding of the game's plot, I still believe these criticisms are valid, as it would help the Resident Evil 4 remake be a better standalone game, because no matter how large a franchise may be, every game in that franchise should be able to stand on its own. My number one criticism of the Resident Evil 4 remake is the pacing of the game's plot. This criticism comes in two parts. The first being the game's tendency to be extremely slow in revealing important plot information, which kept the player in the dark for the first and second act of the game. Now you might be thinking, of course you didn't know what was going on, you've never played the games. While this is a fair point, I'll just point out that this plot information is eventually revealed in the game's third act, meaning the game's developers thought this information was important enough to include in the game, but they just did it way too late. The information concerning Major Krauser and Operation Javier, which ties the game's plot together, should be at least hinted at in the first act. I would argue that the game's first act should end with the introduction of Major Krauser, because fans of the franchise would recognize him and new Resident Evil players could already be familiar with him by the time he comes back around in the third act, so it wouldn't seem so random. The second part of this criticism revolves around Ashley. Over the course of this game, Ashley Graham is taken 4 times and we have to save her 4 times. This structure became extremely repetitive and predictable in the game's second act, and ultimately created a very mundane gaming experience. I would argue that rather than saving Ashley at the end of the first act in Chapter 4, it would be more important to introduce Major Krauser instead, saving Ashley's initial rescue until the game's midpoint in Chapter 8. This would allow for important plot information to be introduced early in Major Krauser and Operation Javier, and also reduce some of the repetitiveness of repeatedly saving Ashley nearly every other chapter. Not having ever played any Resident Evil games, the switch to playing as Ashley really threw me for a loop in Chapter 9. However, the stealthy approach of playing as Ashley was a refreshing change of pace from the hectic run and gun style of playing as Leon. Apparently switching players is very common in the Resident Evil franchise, but my criticism isn't the actual act of switching players, it revolves more around how the game decided to do it. The Resident Evil 4 remake waited way too long to introduce this game mechanic. Having a second playable character in a game is a big deal since it is the non-traditional way of telling a story. Something like this needs to be introduced in the game's first act, so the player knows early on to expect it. Waiting until past the game's midpoint to switch characters is far too long, as the player has already grown accustomed to playing as Leon. This makes the switch to Ashley in Chapter 9 very random and almost jarring. The character switch in the first act wouldn't even need to be to Ashley, which it would likely be very boring given she's just locked away in a dark room in a church, but rather to any of the other characters simply to introduce the game mechanic to the player. And this leads me to my third criticism. I spent much of this game wondering why these two characters even existed. They sporadically appeared every couple chapters and spoke vaguely about the game's plot and didn't really offer anything to the player. I don't think this game would drastically change if these two characters were excluded. Obviously, Luis is responsible for handing over the Plaga to Lord Sadler, and Ada is from previous Resident Evil games. But this information alone isn't enough to justify their presence in their current roles. Their presence simply doesn't feel connected enough to Leon's and the players to even matter. For the entire game, I wondered why Ada, Luis, and Leon didn't team up more given their shared interest. Luis and Ada needed the Amber, which was held by Lord Sadler. Leon needed Ashley, who was also held by Lord Sadler. Why didn't the three team up more? We only get one chapter where we play alongside Luis Serra, which in my opinion was the most enjoyable chapter. So why not have more chapters where we play alongside Ada and Luis? Why not do a player switch to Ada after Chapter 2 when she saves Leon from Mendez? It's a natural transition point. It would introduce the player to the character switch game mechanic so it's not so jarring switching to Ashley in Chapter 9, and it would familiarize the player more with Ada and Luis's mission. Most importantly, it would get these two characters more involved in the game. My last criticism deals with two major gameplay mechanics that nearly ruined the game for me. The first being Leon's painfully slow movement speed. I had to double check that I was pressing the right button to sprint because Leon is just that slow at sprinting. Now this wouldn't be a big deal regularly. Maybe the developers wanted realistic movement speed or to create a sense of anxiety in the player, but Leon Kennedy is a highly trained military operative. At this point it isn't even a gameplay issue, it's a plot hole. He should be able to run faster than Michael DeSantis' fat ass. And if the developers didn't want him to run faster, then a permanent dodge button should have been introduced. Repeatedly throughout the game it seemed that Leon's movement speed was not able to keep up with that of the enemies, which created a serious imbalance that nearly broke the game. The second gameplay critique revolves around Ashley. Holy crap, this girl is dumb. She has zero, absolutely zero survival instinct. Obviously she isn't a highly trained soldier like Leon or a total badass like Luis and Ada, but she should at least try to flee from enemies trying to grab her and not stand in the open to be hit by flaming fireballs flying through the sky. Given the game's entire objective is to save this girl, she should at least be likable. And the fact she is essentially an anchor weighing you down around every turn made me want to find the first chopper out of Spain and leave her in that village. Let me know your thoughts on the Resident Evil 4 remake in the comments below. Do you agree with my critiques of the games, or am I just totally off the mark? If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and hit the subscribe button and click the notification bell to follow along with future playthroughs and game breakdowns on the channel. Peace.